Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
Thank you. It is great to be here.
Imagine standing in your local public school library where, literally, overnight, just a single anonymous email complaint results in the immediate removal of, 500 books.
Right, which sounds totally wild.
It really does. It sounds like a premise from some dystopian science fiction novel, doesn't it? But in 2024, that is not fiction at all. That is just local administrative policy playing out in school districts across the country.
Yeah, it is happening every single day now.
It is. The topic we shall discuss in today's show, the culture war CRT, book banning, and the fight over woke. I am your host, Alex.
And I am Sam. So today we are embarking on a mission, really.
Absolutely.
We are taking an entirely impartial, strictly factual look at the modern American culture war over education and identity. And the goal of this deep dive is absolutely not to take a political side.
Right. That is not what we do here.
Exactly. Instead, we want to unpack the actual architecture of this conflict, looking closely at the provided source material. We are going to examine the history that led us here, the precise legal and administrative mechanics of modern book banning, and, the fascinating evolution of the word woke.
Which is quite a journey, honestly.
It really is. And finally, we will look at the massive political and financial machinations that are currently driving school board battles today.
And if you are listening to this, you might be asking yourself, well, why should I care?
Yeah, a lot of people think, I don't have kids in school, so it doesn't affect me.
Right. Maybe you don't even have kids in the school system right now.
Yeah.
But you have probably seen those viral videos of parents just screaming at school board meetings popping up on your social media timeline.
Oh, they are everywhere. You can't escape them.
You really can't. And you might have thought, well, I am just glad that is not my town. But what we are going to explore today, based on the text, is how those viral moments are actually engineered to eventually reach your town.
Which is a pretty sobering thought.
It is. Yeah. Because whether you have children or not, this conflict is fundamentally about how a nation decides what is true. It is about what kind of citizens a society is trying to build. And ultimately, it is about who holds the power to define the American story.
It really is. And when you look at the historical record provided in the source material, one of the most crucial insights is that this culture war is not some spontaneous, 2020s invention fueled purely by social media algorithms.
Right. It goes way, way back.
It is deeply rooted in the very founding of the Republic. If we look back to the drafting of the country's foundational documents, the architects of the United States disagreed profoundly on the meaning of equality.
Specifically regarding the institution of slavery.
Right, exactly. You have the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, which contains that ringing, immortal assertion that all men are created equal. But it was drafted by men who were, at that exact moment, running massive plantations dependent entirely on enslaved labor.
It is just this massive glaring contradiction right at the start.
It is the great American contradiction. And that tension, that fundamental, irreconcilable disagreement about who actually belongs and who gets to fully participate in the American story, it has never been resolved.
We are still fighting that exact same philosophical battle today.
We really are. And the text shows how you can draw a perfectly straight historical line from that founding tension directly to the aftermath of the Civil War.
Yeah, let's talk about that because the Reconstruction era is fascinating.
It is. Following emancipation, there was this incredible, unprecedented effort to educate those who had been enslaved. The Freedmen's Bureau, along with various missionary societies, established thousands of schools across the South.
Right, and W.E.B. Du Bois famously called it the most amazing educational system in the history of the world. Because literally overnight, you had a population that had been legally forbidden to read, suddenly building a massive infrastructure for public education.
But as history shows us, this was met with fierce, violent resistance.
Right. And after the political collapse of Reconstruction, a massive cultural counter-revolution took place. And this is where the history in our source material gets really structural,
Yeah, it wasn't just a change in social attitudes.
Exactly. It was a deliberate rewriting of educational policy.
This is a crucial piece of historical context if you want to understand today's debates over curriculum. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the lost cause narrative was systematically institutionalized.
It became official policy.
Yes, as official educational policy in the South, and eventually in many northern schools as well. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy formed specific textbook review committees.
Wow. actual committees just to review school books.
Oh, yeah. They aggressively vetted school materials, openly demanding the rejection of any book that suggested the South fought the Civil War to preserve slavery.
So they were actively mandating a completely fabricated history.
Completely.
Yeah.
Generations of children were handed textbooks that portrayed enslaved people as happy and content and claimed that slavery had this benevolent civilizing effect.
Which is just horrifying to think about.
It is. And they painted the Confederacy as this noble endeavor fighting strictly for states' rights. It wasn't just a cultural myth floating around. It was state-sanctioned historical revisionism encoded directly into the public curriculum.
It was literally the law of the land in many educational jurisdictions. I want to frame this with an analogy for you, just to make it clear.
Go for it.
If the American education system is a complex operating system, that lost cause historical revisionism was basically a massive piece of corrupted code intentionally programmed into the system over a century ago.
That is a really great way to visualize it.
Right. So logically, the current progressive pushes for inclusive history, like teaching about systemic racism, redlining, and the brutal realities of slavery, are simply a correction patch designed to fix that century-old corrupted code.
A patch to make the system actually reflect reality.
Exactly. But if that is the case, I have to ask, why is this correction patch being treated by massive segments of the population as a malicious, system-destroying virus?
Well, that is the defining question of our era. And to answer it, the text suggests we have to look at when the modern concept of the culture war actually emerged in American sociological thought.
Okay, so when did that term actually gain traction?
The term was popularized by a sociologist named James Davison Hunter, who published a highly influential book in 1991 called Culture Wars: The Struggle to Define America.
And what did he find?
Hunter observed something fascinating. He noticed that the primary fault line in American society was no longer between different religious denominations.
So it wasn't just like Catholics versus Protestants anymore.
Right. Instead, the fault line was between two fundamentally different worldviews, which he labeled the orthodox and the progressive.
Let's break those down clearly for the listener. What exactly defines those two worldviews in Hunter's framework?
Well, the orthodox worldview derives its moral authority from traditional, transcendent sources. This means rules and values are eternal, fixed, often divinely ordained, and not really subject to human revision.
Okay, that makes sense. And the progressive worldview?
The progressive worldview, on the other hand, derives its moral authority from personal experience, continuous scientific discovery, and evolving human reason. In this view, truth and values must continually adapt to new information and changing social conditions.
And that sociological framework perfectly sets the stage for the political explosion of the 1990s.
It really does.
I mean, this is precisely what fueled Pat Buchanan's famous 1992 speech at the Republican National Convention, right?
Yeah.
Where he explicitly declared that America was engaged in a cultural war for the soul of the country.
Yes, and he described it as being as critical as the Cold War itself. And even before Buchanan, the groundwork for this clash was laid by the massive upheavals of the 1960s civil rights movement. That movement fundamentally demanded the nation account for the massive gap between its egalitarian ideals and its actual discriminatory practices.
Which was a massive shock to that orthodox worldview.
Exactly. And that societal reckoning led directly to what academics call the canon wars in universities during the 1980s.
Right, like the massive protest at Stanford University. Students were looking at the mandatory Western culture curriculum and demanding it be expanded.
They wanted a seat at the table.
Yeah, they wanted to include non-Western, non-white, and non-male authors,
Yep.
arguing that the traditional curriculum presented a highly skewed, really narrow version of human intellectual history.
And this establishes a historical rule of thumb that the source material points out. Whenever an academic correction or expansion moves from the isolated environment of the university into the mainstream public sphere, it inevitably sparks a massive organized backlash.
Because the orthodox worldview perceives it as a threat.
Exactly. The orthodox worldview perceives that expansion not as a simple correction, but as a direct attack on the foundational transcendent truths of the culture.
Which brings us to the absolute epicenter of the current culture war. Critical race theory, or CRT.
Yes, the biggest buzzword of the last few years.
I mean, over the last few years, this acronym has just been everywhere. It is on the news, it is on protest signs at school boards, it is in political campaign ads. But the text highlights this massive gap between what CRT actually is in an academic sense and what it has been turned into in the public imagination.
The academic origin of CRT is entirely distinct from the current political panic. If we look back at the late 1970s and 1980s, legal scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw were observing a really frustrating legal paradox.
Okay, what was the paradox?
Well, the civil rights legislation of the 1960s had been passed. Explicitly racist laws had been struck down, so the laws on the books were formally colorblind.
Right, legally speaking, everything was supposed to be equal.
But yet they noticed that profound racial disparities in housing, wealth, education, and criminal justice were persisting, and in some cases, they were actually worsening.
So they were trying to figure out why a supposedly colorblind legal system was still producing these deeply unequal, racially stratified outcomes.
Precisely. And their answer was critical race theory. It was fundamentally a legal and analytical framework.
So it wasn't something being taught to kindergartners.
Not at all. It argued that racism isn't just a matter of individual prejudice. It isn't just about someone holding animosity in their heart or using a slur. Instead, racism is embedded in systems and property laws, in zoning ordinances, and in institutional structures.
That makes a lot of sense when you look at how cities were built.
Right. CRT theorized that if a system was built over centuries on racial hierarchy, merely removing the explicit racist language from the law wouldn't magically fix the underlying structural inequality.
Because the foundation is still skewed.
Exactly. In fact, formally, colorblind laws could actually perpetuate that inequality by freezing the status quo in place and ignoring the accumulated compounding effects of historical discrimination.
I want to make sure we are incredibly clear here for the listener. This was a graduate-level, highly complex legal and policy analysis framework.
Absolutely.
It was taught in law schools to aspiring attorneys and judges. The foundational texts of critical race theory never claimed that all white people are inherently biologically racist.
No, they did not.
And they never argued that a white second grader should feel personal guilt or anguish for the institution of slavery. So I have to push back here based on what we are reading.
Sure. Was the disconnect.
If this was strictly a niche, graduate-level legal theory from the 1980s, how on earth did suburban parents in 2021 become absolutely convinced that CRT was hiding in their elementary school children's math textbooks? That jump simply does not make sense organically.
You are right. It didn't happen organically at all. The source material outlines how it was the result of a highly deliberate, coordinated political strategy.
Okay, so where did the spark come from?
The initial spark that moved these conversations closer to the mainstream was the 2019 publication of the 1619 Project by the New York Times, which sought to reframe the American founding around the arrival of the first enslaved Africans.
Right, which was a huge cultural moment.
It was provocative, it won a Pulitzer, and it generated intense scholarly debate among historians, but the political response was a full-blown cultural panic.
And that panic escalated dramatically in 2020. We saw Donald Trump issue an executive order directing federal agencies to immediately end diversity training programs that used concepts purportedly drawn from CRT.
Yes, explicitly labeling them as un-American and divisive propaganda.
But the real turning point, the mechanism that turned a legal theory into a household panic, was a strategic rebranding campaign.
Yes, it is largely credited to a conservative activist named Christopher Rufo. And we really don't have to guess at his motives, because he was remarkably transparent about them.
Wait, really? He just admitted it.
He publicly stated his explicit goal was to appropriate the term critical race theory and completely redefine it in the public mind.
He essentially admitted to creating a linguistic weapon. That is wild.
He did. He stated that the objective was to rebrand CRT to encompass the entire range of progressive social justice ideology. The strategy was to make the term so toxic and so broad that anytime the public read about something controversial or upsetting in the news regarding race or gender, they would immediately associate it with critical race theory.
It is honestly a brilliant, if incredibly cynical, political tactic. I mean, he took a technical-sounding academic label, something most people didn't understand but sounded vaguely intimidating, and turned it into an all-purpose bucket for any progressive idea about race, diversity, equity, or inclusion.
And it worked beyond any political strategist's wildest dreams. Suddenly, school board meetings across the country were flooded with furious parents demanding to know if CRT was being taught to their children.
In districts where it absolutely wasn't?
Right. And they were doing this in school districts where the elementary school teachers had never even heard of Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw, let alone assign their legal treatises to third graders.
Let's use a medical analogy to really conceptualize the mechanics of what happened here for you. Imagine taking the clinical Latin name for an incredibly rare, complex, fatal neurological disorder.
Okay.
Now imagine a coordinated media campaign that deliberately convinces the general public that every single time they get a common cold, a seasonal allergy, or a mild headache, it is actually a symptom of that terrifying, rare, fatal disease.
That is a great comparison.
Suddenly, millions of people are in a state of absolute panic over everyday, common symptoms, genuinely believing they are facing a lethal threat.
That is a perfect way to visualize the semantic distortion that occurred. And the result of that manufactured panic was a massive legislative tsunami.
Yeah, we saw so many laws pass.
Between 2021 and 2024, more than 40 states introduced bills specifically designed to restrict how race, history, and gender are discussed in public schools.
Florida's Stop Woke Act is probably the most famous or maybe infamous example of this.
Yes, the Stop Woke Act is incredibly sweeping. The text notes that it literally prohibits instruction that might make a student feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress on account of their race or sex.
But just think about the practical application of that law. How can a teacher possibly guarantee how a historical fact will make a student feel?
They can't. It is impossible.
Right. If you teach the brutal realities of the Holocaust, or the Trail of Tears, or chattel slavery accurately, a deeply empathetic student probably should feel some level of anguish or distress about human cruelty.
It is a normal human reaction.
Because the law relies on the subjective emotional reaction of the student, it creates an environment of massive legal and professional uncertainty for educators.
Which is exactly the intended effect. When teachers don't know exactly where the legal line is and their career or their teaching license is on the line, they don't walk up to the line.
They stay miles away from it.
Exactly. They simply stop talking about race or difficult history altogether. They self-censor. But here is the critical escalation highlighted in the source material. Once a political movement successfully uses the legislature to control the active curriculum and silence the teachers, the next logical target is the passive curriculum.
Which means the library.
Yes. The movement targets the very room where students go to learn independently and privately, the school library.
And over the last few years, the public and school library has transitioned from this quiet sanctuary of learning into an absolute vicious battlefield.
The data on this is truly staggering. According to the American Library Association, starting in 2021, there was an unprecedented spike in organized book challenges.
How big of a spike are we talking about?
So put it in perspective, in 2022 alone, there were over 1,200 organized demands to censor library books, targeting more than 2,500 unique titles.
Over 1,200.
Yeah.
That is massive.
It isn't just a slight uptick. It is a coordinated national movement. And what is most revealing is looking at the specific demographic profile of the books being targeted.
Right, because these are not just random equal opportunity challenges. The targeted books overwhelmingly feature LGBTQ plus identities and the lived experiences of Black Americans.
Yes, very specific themes.
We are talking about titles like Genderqueer, which is a graphic novel memoir about navigating gender identity. We are talking about and Tango Makes Three, which is literally a children's picture book based on the true story of two male penguins raising a chick at the Central Park Zoo.
A true story about penguins.
Exactly. And we are talking about Pulitzer Prize-winning works by Toni Morrison, like The Bluest Eye and Beloved.
To understand how this is happening so rapidly, we have to examine the modern mechanics of book banning. It has evolved far beyond the traditional scenario of, a single concerned parent having a quiet conversation with a local librarian.
It is a whole system now.
It is. Today, there are 3 distinct, highly effective mechanisms being deployed. First is decontextualization.
Which is incredibly effective in the age of social media.
It is. Activists will scour a 300-page novel, find a single paragraph containing graphic or sexually explicit language, strip it entirely of all narrative, literary, or historical context, and then read that isolated paragraph aloud at a televised school board meeting.
Oh, I've seen videos of that.
Right. The goal is to manufacture maximum shock value and outrage, making the book appear to be nothing more than pure pornography, regardless of its overall literary merit.
And the second mechanism, what is that?
The second mechanism involves shifting the legal and administrative burdens. Activists have successfully lobbied for new state laws and local district policies that allow a single parental complaint to trigger a mandatory formal review process.
And while it is under review, the book is gone, right?
Crucially, yes. These policies often dictate that the book must be pulled from the library shelves while the review is pending. This means a single anonymous complaint form can effectively empty a library section for months, bypassing all professional pedagogical review.
And the third mechanism is the political capture of the boards themselves.
Yes. The coordinated election of highly partisan, sympathetic school board members, largely driven by heavily funded national groups like Moms for Liberty. They provide the political muscle to ensure these challenges are sustained and approved.
Now, in the spirit of maintaining total impartiality here, let's examine the stated logic of the challengers, especially regarding a literary masterpiece like Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Fair point.
The challengers almost universally argue that their actions have nothing to do with race or suppressing history. They argue they are simply protecting innocent children from sexually explicit, violently graphic, or Asian-appropriate content.
And it is completely true that Beloved contains intensely graphic and disturbing scenes.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
But we have to look at why those scenes exist. Beloved is fundamentally based on the true historical story of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman who made the unimaginable, horrifying choice to kill her own infant child rather than see that child return to the inescapable brutality of chattel slavery.
It is a horrific piece of history.
It is an exploration of the absolute, deepest psychological and physical horrors of the American slave system.
Which leads to a profound critical observation from the text. You cannot accurately depict the reality of an inherently violent, sexually abusive, and traumatizing institution like slavery without including violent, abusive, and traumatizing themes in the literature.
You just can't separate them.
Therefore, removing a book like Beloved under the guise of merely protecting children from graphic content has a secondary, perhaps more significant effect. It effectively sanitizes history.
Right.
It denies students access to the harsh, complex realities of slavery itself, prioritizing a comfortable, sanitized historical narrative over a truthful one.
And this coordinated legal and political pressure is having a devastating, chilling effect on the librarians themselves. I mean, these are highly trained professionals, individuals who dedicated their careers to the principles of intellectual freedom and information access.
Wow, they are treated like villains.
Exactly. Now, they are finding themselves on the absolute front lines of a vicious culture war, often facing extreme personal harassment and doxing.
It has escalated beyond harassment to actual legal jeopardy. The source material points to a specific 2022 law passed in Missouri.
What did that law do?
It explicitly eliminated previous legal protections that shielded educators and librarians. This change potentially exposes local public librarians to criminal prosecution, actual jail time under state obscenity statutes, simply for providing students access to materials that the state later deems inappropriate.
Just imagine that scenario. Imagine waking up, going to work at a middle school library, and facing the very real threat of criminal charges and imprisonment just for checking out a memoir to a teenager.
It is unthinkable for a librarian.
It is completely unsurprising that we are seeing a massive, unprecedented wave of resignations, early retirements, and burnout among librarians nationwide. The system is being drained of its professional expertise.
And the rationale keeps coming back to one word.
Yes. The overarching justification used over and over again in the media for removing these books, restricting these lessons, and passing these laws is that they are simply too woke, which leads us perfectly into the fascinating and honestly tragic linguistic journey of that specific word.
If you want a perfect case study in how modern culture wars operate, the text says to look at the linguistic history of the word woke. It traces its origins all the way back to the 1930s and 1940s within African-American vernacular.
So it is almost 100 years old.
In that original context, it had a highly specific, vital meaning. It meant being alert to systemic racial injustice and physical danger.
One of the earliest recorded uses is in Leadbelly's 1938 folk song about the Scottsboro Boys, right?
Exactly. The Scottsboro Boys were a group of black teenagers falsely accused of a horrific crime in Alabama, subjected to a notoriously racist kangaroo court justice system.
A terrible travesty of justice.
At the end of the song, Leadbelly explicitly cautions black listeners traveling through the South to stay woke. It wasn't a political slogan. It was a literal warning about a life or death danger that you could not afford to ignore. It meant keeping your eyes open to the reality of the world around you.
And the word largely stayed within the confines of African-American vernacular for decades. It didn't cross over into the mainstream white consciousness until around 2013. Propelled by the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of Trayvon Martin.
Right, that is when it really hit the mainstream.
In that context, it was a sincere, urgent rallying cry for broad social awareness of systemic racism and police brutality. But then between roughly 2018 and 2021, conservative media and political operatives executed a flawless campaign to completely capture the term.
The sociological concept at play here is known as semantic capture.
How does that work?
This is a highly effective rhetorical process where a specific word or phrase is entirely stripped of its original historical meaning. Through sustained, coordinated repetition across massive media networks, the word is transformed and weaponized to serve an entirely different, often diametrically opposed political purpose.
I think the best way to understand semantic capture is think of it like intellectual property theft, or maybe like an invasive species.
Oh, I like the invasive species idea.
Imagine you take a plant, a word that is native to a very specific contained ecosystem, in this case, African-American vernacular. It serves a specific healthy purpose in that ecosystem. But then massive media networks uproot that word and drop it into the mainstream political ecosystem, an environment where it has no natural predators, no historical context to keep it in check.
And it just takes over.
They feed it with billions of dollars of outrage-driven airtime, and the word just explodes. It completely overruns the original meaning, strangling it out, until the invasive definition is the only one anyone recognizes. Woke became this massive, vague, invasive weed of a word.
That is a brilliant analogy. Through semantic capture, woke became a highly useful, all-purpose pejorative. It no longer meant alert to injustice.
It meant something else entirely.
It became a catch-all insult for absolutely anything progressive, from corporate diversity training to a television show featuring a transgender character to a teacher simply acknowledging that redlining existed. It became a way to attack progressive ideas without ever having to engage with the actual substance of those ideas.
But logically, if we look at the literal definition, I have to point out a glaring paradox from the text.
Go on.
If the original definition of woke meant being alert to injustice, doesn't proudly declaring yourself to be anti-woke logically mean that you're actively choosing to ignore injustice?
That is the exact paradox many sociologists point out. Stripped of its rhetorical camouflage, the anti-woke position fundamentally implies a preference not to be alert to historical or systemic injustice, or at the very least a preference that public institutions should not expend resources focusing on or remediating it. However, and this is crucial for impartial analysis, the anti-woke movement absolutely does not frame its actions as ignoring injustice.
Right, they frame it entirely differently.
They do. They frame their actions as defending traditional American values, protecting the innocence of children, and, most powerfully and consistently, as defending parents' rights.
And that concept, parents' rights, brings us to a massive ideological paradox that sits at the very core of this entire battle over education. If we look closely at the history of conservative political philosophy, we see a massive, almost dizzying shift in how they view the role of government in education.
It is a profound ideological flip.
Totally.
For the vast majority of the 20th century, particularly during the Reagan era and beyond, the American political right championed the concept of local control. The conservative position was that education should be managed by local school boards and local communities, and they fiercely resisted heavy-handed mandates from the federal or state government.
But today, in 2024, that philosophy has been entirely inverted.
It is the exact opposite now.
We are seeing conservative movements cheer on the aggressive use of centralized state-powered governors and state legislatures to mandate exactly what can and cannot be taught in every single public classroom across the state, overriding local school boards entirely.
And the vehicle for this state intervention is the rhetoric of parents' rights. But when we analyze this rhetoric impartially, the source material uncovers a glaring contradiction in its application.
Which is?
The parents' rights framing is highly selective. It aggressively prioritizes the rights of a specific demographic of conservative parents to remove books, restrict curricula, and dictate the educational environment.
But what about the other parents?
Exactly. It completely ignores and often actively overrides the rights of Black, LGBTQ+, or progressive parents who actively desire an inclusive education, diverse library offerings, and a comprehensive curriculum for their own children.
It elevates one specific set of parental demands to the level of unassailable state policy, while completely dismissing the demands of other tax-paying parents in the exact same district.
Precise.
Let me throw out another analogy to test the logic of the parents' rights argument, as it is currently being applied to public institutions. Let's look at medicine.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a parent distrusts a specific pediatrician or has a moral objection to a specific medical treatment, that parent has the absolute, undeniable right to refuse that treatment for their own child.
Sure, absolutely.
But that parent does not have the right to march into the local public hospital, demand a meeting with the hospital board, and dictate that the hospital is legally forbidden from offering that treatment to everyone else's children.
That is the crux of the debate right there.
So why are librarians, who are information professionals, and educators, who are pedagogical experts, being treated so differently than medical professionals? Why is one parent's veto power being allowed to override both professional expertise and the rights of other parents in the community?
It is a profound tension between individual liberty and public accommodation. And this tension places public school teachers right in the absolute center of the crossfire.
Which has to be incredibly stressful.
They are tasked with educating a wildly diverse student body, but they are terrified of running afoul of vaguely worded state laws designed to appease a specific political faction. And we must note, this immense pressure isn't limited to K-12 education. Higher education is feeling the exact same aggressive squeeze from state power.
We have to talk about the state takeover of New College of Florida. That is perhaps the most forceful demonstration of this dynamic in higher education.
It is a perfect example outlined in the text. New College of Florida was a small, public liberal arts college known for its progressive, quirky tradition.
Very independent.
But the state government, acting under the banner of combating woke ideology, essentially executed a hostile takeover.
Just swept right in.
The governor replaced the board of trustees with highly partisan political allies, fired the college president, abolished the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, and began systematically dismantling the institution's progressive culture to replace it with a traditionalist conservative model.
It is a highly visible, incredibly forceful demonstration that dissent from official state ideology will be met with severe institutional consequences. But if we zoom out from the specific schools and the specific laws, this entire battle over whose rights matter most, whose values are centered in the classroom, and whose history is prioritized, is fundamentally a battle of identity politics.
It is, and this is another area where a strictly impartial analysis is required, because the hypocrisy on this issue is fascinating.
Yeah.
We constantly hear conservative politicians and commentators heavily criticizing progressive identity politics, framing it as divisive and un-American.
Right, they attack it constantly.
Yet simultaneously, those same political movements heavily embrace and leverage a highly potent form of white, Christian, grievance-based identity politics.
Both sides of the political spectrum are deeply, inextricably engaged in fighting over whose identity belongs at the absolute center of American civic life.
Let's look at how this plays out with the concept of intersectionality, which is another academic term that gets thrown around constantly, usually as a pejorative, in the culture war.
Let's define it clearly for the listener. The term intersectionality was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And when you look at her actual original work, it is a remarkably modest, highly specific analytical claim.
Yes. Crenshaw developed the concept to address a specific legal blind spot. To give a real-world example from her work, she looked at the DeGraff-and-Reed v. General Motors case.
What happened in that case?
Black women were laid off during a recession, and they sued for discrimination. But the court dismissed their case. The court's logic was, well, GM hires women, mostly white women, for secretarial roles, so there is no gender discrimination. And GM hires black people, mostly black men, for factory floor roles, so there is no racial discrimination.
But Crenshaw pointed out the obvious flaw in that logic. Black women were facing a unique, compounding form of discrimination that you simply could not understand by looking at race or gender in total isolation.
They were falling through the cracks.
They were falling through the cracks of a legal system that demanded they choose one single axis of oppression. Intersectionality simply observes that overlapping marginalized identities create unique, specific forms of lived experience and discrimination.
But in the crucible of the modern culture war, that highly specific legal tool has been flattened into a grotesque caricature.
How so?
In conservative media, intersectionality is portrayed as a rigid caste system that determines an individual's total moral worth solely based on their immutable identity characteristics.
And that caricature has fueled a massive, highly successful backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, programs across the country.
It culminated in the massive Supreme Court ruling in 2023, which effectively ended race-conscious university admissions, overturning decades of affirmative action precedent.
That was a huge legal shift.
And what is critical to understand is that the political operatives who drove that Supreme Court victory immediately pivoted. They used that legal momentum to aggressively pressure private corporations and public institutions into rolling back their internal diversity efforts, threatening them with massive lawsuits if they continued DEI programs.
Now, as promised, to remain entirely impartial, we absolutely must explore the legitimate critiques of progressive excesses because they do exist in the text. When progressive identity politics shift from being a tool for inclusive analysis into a rigid system of moral purity, it creates massive problems.
It certainly can. There are well-documented contexts, often in corporate HR departments, elite university campuses, or left-leaning activist circles where the concept of intersectionality is misused.
How does that misuse show up?
In these spaces, accumulating marginalized identities can sometimes be treated as a form of unassailable moral authority, shutting down legitimate debate. Furthermore, structural analysis can sometimes be misapplied to evade or excuse individual responsibility, creating environments that feel stifling, puritanical, and highly alienating, even to those who share broad progressive goals.
So there are absolutely legitimate good faith critiques to be had about pedagogy, about the limits of identity politics, and about how history should be taught.
No question about it.
But we have to ask the critical question. How do these complex, nuanced, highly necessary philosophical debates continually get flattened into pure, unadulterated, screaming outrage?
To answer that, the source material points us behind the curtain at the amplification machine. We have to follow the money and the media.
The money trail.
We live in a highly optimized attention economy, and the simple, undeniable algorithmic truth is that moral outrage generates vastly more engagement, clicks, and advertising revenue than consensus, nuance, or good faith debate ever could. The culture war is incredibly profitable.
Which means the outrage we see at these school food meetings isn't just spontaneous. It isn't just organic local parental uprisings happening simultaneously by pure coincidence.
Not at all. There is a massive, incredibly well-funded infrastructure behind the outrage. We're talking about highly organized national entities.
Like who?
Think tanks like the Manhattan Institute, massive conservative policy organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council or ALEB.
Let's explain exactly how this infrastructure operates, because it is fascinating.
These national organizations draft what are known as template or model legislation. They write the actual legal text for bills restricting CRT, banning specific topics, or restructuring library review processes.
They just hand them a finished bill.
Yes, they write the white papers justifying the bills. Then they distribute those exact templates to allied state legislators across the country. That is why you will see virtually identical bills with the exact same phrasing appear simultaneously in dozens of different state legislatures within weeks of each other.
I compared this process to a massive fast food franchise model. Think about it.
Okay, I am listening.
A local citizen might be the one physically standing at the microphone at the local school board meeting, serving up the outrage to their specific community. They are the local franchisee. But the menu they are reading from, the specific ingredients of their legal argument, the targeted books they are demanding be removed, and the overall political branding of their grievance, all of that was entirely engineered, focus grouped, and packaged at a national corporate think tank headquarters.
The franchise model is highly accurate, and it relies on an incredibly efficient, self-sustaining feedback loop. Let's trace how a single event moves through this machine.
Okay, step one.
Step 1. A local school board dispute occurs. Perhaps a parent, armed with a list provided by a national group, reads a highly decontextualized passage from a library book.
Step 2.
Step 2. That explosive video is recorded and goes viral on social media, boosted by algorithmic outrage. Step 3. It gets picked up by partisan cable news networks, which broadcast it to millions of viewers, framing it as evidence of a national crisis.
Step 4. That massive, media-generated national outrage prompts ambitious state politicians to draft legislation, often using those pre-written templates to ostensibly fix the crisis and score political points.
And then the final step.
Step 5. That sweeping new state legislation drastically alters local policies, which inevitably sparks even more intense local disputes. And the cycle spins again, generating endless engagement, endless donations, and endless profit for the amplification machine.
And while that machine is running constantly, it acts as a massive distraction. It completely prevents society from having substantive, productive conversations about the actual material challenges facing public education.
Like what?
Like chronic underfunding, decaying infrastructure, teacher shortages, and the massive, unprecedented mental health crisis among students.
But this franchise model of cultural warfare, this political weaponization of education, It isn't limited to America's borders, is it?
No, not at all. When we zoom out, the text shows this is a global structural pattern. In the UK, there are intense, highly politicized debates over how to teach the history of the British Empire and colonialism.
It is happening everywhere.
In Hungary, Viktor Orban's government has systematically suppressed gender studies programs, explicitly to align the university curriculum with his brand of Christian nationalist political ideology. In India, the Hindu nationalist government is aggressively rewriting and revising history curricula to systematically downplay and marginalize the historical contributions of Muslims.
So what we're really seeing is a global, coordinated reassertion of traditional ethno-nationalist identities, pushing back violently against pluralist, democratic ideals.
Exactly. And looking domestically in the United States, we have to examine the deep, highly potent religious undercurrents driving this conflict, which are often obscured by the First Amendment.
This is a crucial, often overlooked piece of the puzzle. Because of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the government cannot establish a religion.
Which creates a legal barrier for these groups.
Practically, this means a public school board cannot legally ban a book from a public library simply because the contents of that book offend a specific religious doctrine. Public schools are legally bound to be secular. They cannot promote or enforce one religious viewpoint over another.
So, because they cannot use explicit religious arguments to achieve their political goals, Christian nationalist movements and highly conservative religious groups are forced into a rhetorical translation.
How do they translate it?
They take their fundamental theological objections, particularly their religious objections regarding LGBTQ+ identities and non-traditional family structures, and they translate those theological objections into secular, legal-sounding, administrative language.
This is why you rarely hear a parent at a school board meeting explicitly say, "My specific interpretation of the Bible forbids homosexuality, therefore this book must be removed." They know that argument will fail in a secular court.
It would be thrown out immediately.
Instead, they say, "This material is strictly inappropriate for this age group," or "This book violates community standards of decency." They translate theological outrage into the secular language of child protection in order to pass constitutional muster.
Exactly. They're fighting a theological war using secular administrative weapons. And the First Amendment legalities surrounding this are incredibly complex and heavily litigated.
Let's talk about the case law on this.
Sure, there are two major contrasting Supreme Court cases that define this battleground. The first is the landmark 1982 case, Island Trees School District v. Pico.
Let's explain PICO because it is vital to the library debate. In that case, a conservative parents group gave a school board a list of objectionable books. The school board literally went into the high school library at night and removed them, but the Supreme Court stepped in.
The Supreme Court ruled that local school boards cannot remove books from public school libraries simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books.
So they protected the library.
They ruled that the library is a unique space of voluntary inquiry, and that viewpoint discrimination by the government in a library setting violates students' First Amendment rights to receive information.
So PICO theoretically protects the library. But then you contrast that with the 2006 case, Garcetti v. Chabalos.
Yes. Garcetti established that public employees do not have First Amendment protection for speech issued as part of their official mandatory job duties.
So how does that apply to teachers?
When applied to education, this means that when a teacher is delivering the state-mandated curriculum in a classroom, they are speaking for the state, not themselves. Therefore, the state has massive leeway to dictate, restrict, and punish what teachers say during instructional time.
It is a terrifying constitutional tightrope for educators. Now, just to bring absolute balance back to this point about religion, because we are committed to impartiality, we have to point out a fascinating irony on the political left that is discussed in the text.
Okay, let's hear it.
While conservative movements translate theology into secularism, certain strands of secular progressive anti-racism have actually evolved their own quasi-religious structures.
This is a point frequently made by sociologist and linguist John McWhorter, who is cited in the text. He observes that some modern political movements on the left, despite being fiercely secular on paper, have organically developed features that are remarkably akin to traditional religion.
It is so interesting to look at it that way.
They have developed concepts akin to original sin, which they frame as inherent racial privilege. They've established highly ritualized mechanisms for public confession and atonement.
Like public apologies and reading lists.
Exactly. And perhaps most significantly, they have developed swift, severe mechanisms for excommunication and social banishment for anyone who steps out of line or questions the prevailing orthodoxy.
It is a truly fascinating observation about human psychology. It suggests that human beings have a deeply ingrained need for religious-style structures, for purity, for clear moral binaries, for in-groups and out-groups, and they will apply those structures to political movements if traditional religion is absent.
Absolutely. We are pattern-seeking creatures.
So with all of these massive tectonic forces clashing complex legal doctrines, billions of dollars in financial incentives, deeply held theological beliefs, and outrage-maximizing social media algorithms, we have to bring this conversation back down to the ground level. We have to look at the human cost. What actually happens to the children who are caught squarely in the crossfire of this massive adult war?
To fully understand the long-term impact on the next generation, we have to look back at historical moral panics because society has been through this exact cycle before.
Give us some examples.
We can look at the Lavender Scare of the 1950s, where the government purged thousands of employees under the paranoid delusion that homosexuals were a massive security threat. We can look at the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, where innocent daycare workers were literally sent to prison based on entirely fabricated mass hysteria claims of satanic ritual abuse.
Or we can look at the 1950s panic over comic books, driven by a psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham in his book Seduction of the Innocent.
Oh, that was a huge one.
He literally convinced the United States Senate that reading Batman and Robin was causing a massive wave of juvenile delinquency, leading the comic industry to essentially censor and destroy its own creative potential for decades.
These historical panics always follow the exact same predictable pattern. First, they take a limited, complex social phenomenon and artificially inflate it into an apocalyptic existential threat to the safety of children.
Then what happens?
Second, they systematically attack and destroy the credibility of professional expertise, whether that means comic book editors in the 50s or highly trained teachers and librarians today. And third, and most tragically, society only realizes its mistake and course corrects long after massive, unjust, and often permanent damage has been done to individuals and institutions.
But there's a reason to believe that this current panic over education and identity is fundamentally different and potentially much more dangerous than those historical examples.
It is different primarily because of its political utility. This isn't just a fleeting organic social anxiety that will burn itself out. It has been deeply structurally integrated into a major political party's ongoing long-term electoral strategy.
It is a permanent fixture now.
It is a durable, highly funded part of a political coalition. Furthermore, unlike a panic over comic books, this current conflict touches upon deeply irreducible, permanent societal disagreements about race, historical memory, and human sexuality. These are fundamental philosophical divides that simply cannot be resolved with a quick factual correction or a single court ruling.
To bring all this vast theory down to the human level, I want to share a poignant hypothetical from the text's epilogue that really grounds everything we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a 12-year-old black girl named Amara. She is curious, she is smart, and she walks into her local public school library looking for books to help her understand her history, her identity, and her place in this incredibly complex country.
A completely normal thing for a kid to do.
But instead of finding a rich, diverse collection, she finds sparse, half-empty shelves because the books reflecting her experience have been pulled into a massive, bureaucratic, politically motivated review process.
And we must contrast Amara's experience with the parent across town who initiated that review process. This is a parent who genuinely loves their child. They are writing to the school board because they desperately want their child to feel pride and optimism about America, and they have a genuine, if misplaced, fear that learning about the harsh realities of systemic racism will make their child feel guilty, alienated, or unpatriotic.
We have these two deeply human needs colliding in the exact same public space. And it forces us to ask the central, echoing question of this entire conflict.
What is the question?
What does it cost our society to have both of those children inhabit the exact same library? What does it truly cost us to allow them both to sit down and learn the full, beautiful, inspiring, and simultaneously deeply painful and brutal truth of their shared country?
That question cuts to the epistemic foundations of democracy itself. A functioning democracy requires citizens who share a common reality, but who are also capable of wrestling with complex, contradictory truths.
We have to be able to handle both.
If we systematically limit what can be taught, if we allow political factions to remove books from libraries out of fear and discomfort, we are actively degrading the ability of future citizens to understand the complexities of their own society.
I want to read the formal subtitle of the source text for you now to really cement exactly what we've been exploring for the past hour. The subtitle is The Political Weaponization of Education and Identity in 21st Century America.
It perfectly, succinctly encapsulates the vast mechanics and the profound stakes of everything we've discussed today.
It does. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a brand new, provocative thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked.
A final thought for the listener.
We are looking at a world facing unprecedented existential challenges, climate change, artificial intelligence, global pandemics, massive economic shifts. If we spend an entire generation deliberately training our children to fear complex, uncomfortable truths in the safety of their local school libraries, how can we possibly expect them to have the intellectual resilience, the critical thinking, and the innovative courage required to solve the massive, complex, global crises of the future?
That is a very powerful point.
If a teenager isn't allowed to handle the discomfort of a book about history, how on earth are they going to handle the unprecedented, chaotic challenges of tomorrow?
That is exactly what is at stake here. It is not just about the books, it is about the intellectual courage and the democratic capacity of the next generation. And before we go, we must point out that this entire expansive conversation we've just had is derived from the first book of an incredible, monumental 30-volume series.
Yes, the series is titled To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America.
Specifically, the foundational material for today's deep dive came from the book titled Volume 1, America's Healthcare Crisis and Broken Public Institutions, brilliantly authored by Sue B. Howell.
It is an incredibly detailed, rigorously impartial, and thoroughly researched volume that unpacks these systemic issues with astonishing clarity.
It really is an essential read for anyone trying to navigate this current moment. And that book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We highly enthusiastically encourage you to go check out the book, dive into the research for yourself, and please leave your comments and feedback. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.